So our final panel of the morning, as we race to noon, is the tech transfer panel. And we have two speakers in that panel, Brian Ippolito and Raj Rajaram. I think you had a nice introduction to Raj this morning, so I'd like to introduce Brian. Brian has served as president and CEO of Orbis Technologies since 2006. Orbis is a global content management company of software solutions and services with software deployed in 77 cities throughout 14 countries on 4 continents. Brian is a former member of the U.S. Air Force and has received numerous awards and recognition. I won't cite them all. They're in the brochure. Prior to being at Orbis, Brian was at Northrop Grumman, and his work at Northrop Grumman and Orbis benefited tremendously from his research at MIT, primarily in lean enterprise value. He received a bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering from IIT and a master's degree in energy and management from the Sloan School of Management at MIT. He currently serves on our alumni board. So if you'll please join me in welcoming Brian as our first speaker. Brian?
Thank you, everyone. It's great to be back in India, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk. I always like to start out by just putting my biases on the table, and so I'll tell you a little bit about me. We've got operations here in Chennai, India. We've got another business in Sydney, Australia. The amazing part about being in a content management company is our clients are pretty incredible. They're marquee manufacturers: Epson, Texas Instruments, Airbus, Johnson & Johnson, United Healthcare. We've got some of the largest publishers in the world. So what that really does is it gives you a perspective that's really global. In addition to our operations, you get exposed along the way to how these companies operate. And it was interesting, if we took our top 10 clients, they do over $500 billion a year in revenue. And so they're a country unto themselves. I was also a technology transfer executive in my previous life, involved. There's many great organizations up there on the slides that you can go to learn about technology transfer. And that's really the whole spectrum: know-how, intellectual property, patents. IP takes many forms. And then also I was an acquisition officer, and as a government acquisition officer, got exposed to things like offset, which is really critical for many nations. In fact, most people don't know this, but India is the world's largest arms importer. And that's pretty amazing when you think about the Gulf nations, Saudi Arabia, UAE, how wealthy they are. But it turns out India imports more arms than any country in the world. And so they have programs set up for technology transfer, and they're called offset. So I just want to share, when we think about technology transfer and how it impacts all of us, we think of the good, and most people don't know this, but Bangalore is, Goldman Sachs just recently opened an enormous facility, which I had the pleasure to visit on my last trip. It's a $250 million office, which even by Western terms is pretty incredible. But what you may not know is outside of New York City, the Goldman Sachs office here has the second largest number of employees. When you think of Chennai, they have quite the automotive manufacturing. In fact, they also boast the Ford manufacturing plant, which is overseen, by the way, by Mike McCool, who happens to also be an IIT alumni. But that office in Chennai is the second largest employer of Ford employees outside of Dearborn, Michigan. Amazon, who has 2 enormous buildings in Chennai, also a major employer in the region. So when we think of technology transfer and the movement of manufacturing and development around the world, India proudly can hold their head up high and say it's been wonderful, the education opportunities to the employees, the career opportunity to see the world, to see different perspectives, and certainly it has done an amazing transformation of a middle class in India to create wealth that really is multi-generational. You know, even the government has benefited, increased taxes, the things we would traditionally think of, and then infrastructure from the perspective of having local resources to buy from. So we really like technology transfer on the surface, but there are some negative parts to it. I think I saw a study that 1 out of every 4 companies in the United States has been a victim of theft by by China. And I can tell you it's very real. I know our company last year, it's very sophisticated. They have proxy companies set up worldwide that are trying to buy products and reverse engineer them. And for those of you that are in the United States, I can tell you that the U.S. consulates, U.S. embassies have staff set up where you can screen and vet manufacturing partners or business partners. And that's how we found a proxy company trying to take our intellectual property. But it's a real challenge. You know, you've got bureaucracy. It's very difficult to get approvals to move technology around the world. In fact, just making an investment as a parent company in our subsidiary here requires approval from the Indian banks and from the Indian governments. And if the job's not hard enough, then we enter into political trade fights that undermine everything. You know, they start to fight and advocate for certain products that have no impact, no thought of the impact to the environment or to anything else. And then you've got to go through approvals. So you see companies trying. Most recently, I read an article about Textron, which I put up there, that they're pulling out of Indian operations because it was in their mind, too difficult to work with the Indian government. Now, I happen to actually know this particular situation, and it wasn't too difficult to work with them. They just didn't have the appetite to put the energy in. And then at the very bottom, which I think is going to be the theme of the rest of this discussion, is access to capital. So I bring the good and the bad forward because it's really in the last line that these pieces start to link, and it's all about capital, and it's about the movement of capital, the access to capital, and that part of it will be the link to the environment. So there's this unintended consequence of technology transfer. So, you know, the Silicon Valley companies, and I happen to work for a company, a tech company, a software company, and I'm proud of the fact that we have such a broad global footprint, and we have never once raised private equity or venture capital. It's all self-funded. And we chose to sidestep that. But you look at the investments that have been made, and Uber's a great example. You look at the traffic, everyone knows it in India, and to be honest, we could show traffic jams in the United States all day long. But the promise was Uber and in the United States Lyft, that these are somehow going to relieve traffic. And I understand that was great for marketing, but I can tell you it used to be we would go out and say, well, hey, can you pick me up because we don't want to drive? And now everybody says, well, I'll take an Uber. And so we're actually adding more cars to the road. If we were really caring about the environment, they would have invested in a private bus service. But instead, it was more economical to go down the vehicle path. And then we've talked about Chennai. It's been brought up multiple times. But I will tell you, having visited Amazon's facilities in Chennai, those 2 monstrous buildings, unlike the United States, they would have been required to put water retention systems in. They would have been required to make investments in the infrastructure itself by building these enormous buildings. But you don't see that outside of the Western nations. So when you invite the companies in because you want their capital, you want the transfer of intellectual property, what's happening worldwide is it's being done without any thought whatsoever to the environment. And that's really important because I'm not an environmental engineer, but I do believe the statement that says concrete's the most destructive material on Earth. And so, if we're fighting these battles to reforest, to plant, and fighting on the local level, then you have to look at the macro level and say, well, if concrete is the enemy, then let's pull that thread backwards. And it really goes back to technology transfer. As you move companies around the world, they're making enormous investments and the capital investments behind those. And then, last but not least, this is a very famous picture of one of the wealthiest men in the world. And you can see that is his house, that is not his hotel, that is his personal residence. And to the right of that, I'm told, I've never been there, is just a few blocks away. And so, you don't have to be a political scientist to figure out that if technology transfers, creating enormous wealth, and if Silicon Valley and SoftBank are generating enormous profits off of this, and it's limited to a few, at some point the people who live over on the right-hand side are going to get a little pissed off. And that's the truth, right? You only look at it and say, it's really simple. The poor people outnumber the rich. And so trade wars, populism, all of those things, income inequality, there are negative feelings that go with it. We like to look at the positive, as I showed you, the employment and the multi-generational wealth. But at the end of the day, we have to lift everyone up. And when the people at the bottom are suffering the consequences of this global technology transfer, one has to ask the basic question, what's going to happen, right? We know what the environmental impacts are, but we can kind of pull that thread back to capital. And that's really the nexus. That's where everything comes together. So I'll give you a couple statistics. Most people, again, don't know. I didn't know this till I read. The World Bank happens to be one of our clients, and so I get all these great reports that are produced with our software, which we're very proud of, so I figure I should at least read them, right? And so I read this one, and I was shocked to find out that the 4 largest banks in the world are Chinese. They have 35 trillion in assets. The Indian GDP is in 2019 is $4 trillion. The Chinese banks have 35 trillion. US GDP is 20 trillion. So let's just put that in perspective. You look at those red signatures, that's where Chinese banks are investing overseas. And then you look at the graph below and you can see the gray area there, that's investment in those red dots, okay? So again, if you just take a step back and you look at the situation, we know the investment in infrastructure projects, which is largely led by the Chinese, are being done by banks that have really no regulatory or governance or oversight. And one of the things that I find interesting is you pick up the news, and if you didn't go to business school, it seems a little crazy. I read that there were $17 trillion, okay, $17 trillion in negative yield debt. So what does that mean? That means that a bank is paying a government money to lend the government money. Now, you didn't go to business school and you'd say, who the hell would do that? That is ridiculous. Why would you ever do that? And the answer is because you have to. Because the federal governments and the nation states have made it mandatory requirements when they look at evaluating a bank's risk. And it turns out, lo and behold, that borrowing sovereign debt is the lowest risk, and the banks have to do that in order to lend commercial companies money. This is a Western thing, okay? So that's how the banks or the countries are getting buyers for trillions of dollars in debt. And so how does all this tie together? Well, it's really simple. If these companies are doing technology transfer, if they're building large buildings in India, if they're building manufacturing plants, and there's no thought to the environment, then that strain and that burden then falls on the government to figure out a solution forward. The government then has to borrow money. And then the banks that lend the money, of course, have to give it to the governments. So the Western countries have this situation where they pretty much have to borrow or have to buy debt from their nation state. And that leaves very little room for what I would call risky investments or overseas investments. And so the Chinese have very happily filled that void. And so when you make those investments, you have to really ask the question. And I like to pick on Uber because Uber started out, and I read the numbers that roughly a driver in India when Uber first launched made, I think it was maybe $1,400 a month, which is a pretty nice salary for an automobile driver, right? So Uber has now cut that in half. So what does that mean? That means you've got at $800 a month, you have a driver who now has a car payment, who bought a new car to do this business because he or she thought that would be a great prospect for an uneducated person, which it really was a huge opportunity for them. And so now they're stuck with a car payment they can't make, right? There's a reason why automobiles, when you buy them, they say miles per gallon city is not the same as highway, right? And that's because sitting in traffic jam consumes quite a bit of gasoline. So when we make investments and we move technology transfer, the questions that needs to broaden out a little bit and say, what is the ability of the host nation, the people that are taking the technology in, can they consume the unskilled worker? Meaning that is there an opportunity for an unskilled worker to recover? So in the United States, it's pretty simple. I just saw from my personal experience, the county that I live in said we have to cut bus schedules because we can't find drivers for school buses, okay? So for those of you in India, you'd say, well, I think we could fill that job in about 2 seconds. But in the United States, we can't find bus drivers. Restaurants in my city are closing on Mondays because they can't find waiters. So we can consume unskilled workers and we can transform them through education into skilled professionals. But most other nations don't really have that luxury. So when you let an Uber in and you allow them to incentivize these drivers who then make their investments to go buy vehicles, what you're really doing is putting an incredible strain on the nation state in a place that really, really can't actually absorb that kind of impact. And then who suffers the consequences? And the answer is the environment, because that's the last investment that they're going to make. So I would end it with just a discussion, and what I was really hopefully trying to convey is that when we talk about the environment, and in particular link it back to capital flows and technology transfer, we really need to broaden the discussion, and we have to look at the country's incentive to bring companies in, and we all understand and can appreciate the good with that. But the climate change discussion and technology needs to be bigger than just technologies that are about and designed for the environment. We have to have discussions about companies like SoftBank. We have to have discussions about U.S. capital markets. We have to talk about companies like WeWork. And we have to really broaden the discussion to say, when you have $35 trillion in assets held by a country, banks in a country that have no governance, then we as a global community have to take it seriously. This Silicon Valley model, and you'll hear them referred to as unicorns, it's insane. I mean, it is absolutely on another scale. And so their goal is really to a race to market share. They don't care about the consequences. They don't care about the environmental impact. It is simply about adopting market share. And at some point, we're all going to wake up to it. I saw some number that Facebook had, I think, 4 billion users. 4 billion. There's 7 billion people on the planet. Half of them live in Asia. Do you really think in India 90% of the people are Facebook users? So these numbers are ridiculous. But why do they do it? Because they get $15 per user on their market capital valuation. All right? So this incentive structure that we have in the West in the capital markets, and technology is largely to blame, is really incentivizing a race to market share instead of a race to financial health. We saw, I was happy to see the ITC, because I personally stay at ITC hotels, because there's a line in there that talks about sustainability and responsible luxury stays. So there is actually an economic benefit to doing this. So we have to really look at other ways. I brought up offset. Most people don't know what that is. I didn't know until my personal experience. But offset is really saying, hey, the Indian government buys a bunch of aircraft. They expect a certain amount of that money to be reinvested in Indian companies. Well, here's one of there are multiples, right? It's not dollar for dollar. If you hire a firm that provides janitors and administrators, you get a lower multiple for that. But if you bought technology or manufacturing, you would get a higher multiple. Well, there's an easy fix. Put a 20x multiple on any investment in environment. That's it. Incentivize it. You can legislate it. You don't have to. You can use the wealth that the country already has in their expenditures, and you have to really look at creating those incentive structures for companies that do business. And you really have to consider the wealth repatriation and environmental repatriation. And so lastly, what I'll say is that we all have this obligation. I can tell you as a Western company, as an American company, when we own our subsidiaries here, it's about Western values as well. So when we make our investments in our people, we make investments around the world, we do that with our values of equality. We do it with our conscience, and it doesn't matter to me what the local economy is or what the local economy pays. We want to make sure that people have a living wage, because when they don't, poverty, when you have massive widespread poverty in any country, the environment is really who suffers. So we really have to look at how we can allow our banks to make infrastructure investments around the world, and that will stimulate technology transfer, but we need to do it in a sensible, environmental friendly way. So with that, I just want to thank you. Thank you for the opportunity, and share with you, like I said, some of my thoughts from dealing with some of the largest companies in the world. So thank you.